Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important and timely discussion hosted by the Washington Kurdish Institute. My name is Dr. Shiran Fuad Usain. I'm a Maria Curie Fellow at Middlesex University, and it is an honor to moderate this panel with our two distinguished speakers, Ambassador Peter Galbraith and Mr. Vincent Campos, who I will more properly introduce a little later before they speak. The focus of our webinar panel today and question that we are posing and discussing is, does Iraq seek to dismantle the Kurdistan region? I will provide a brief introduction and set the historical backdrop for the topic before opening up to our panelists who will examine these details in more depth. To start, today's topic is dealing with the Kurdistan region of Iraq, sometimes abbreviated as the KRI or even the KRG, to represent the Kurdistan regional government, which governs the region. Geographically, this area in northern Iraq is perceived by most Kurds as one of the four parts of Greater Kurdistan and often referred to as Southern Kurdistan. I mention this fact because although the political issues you will hear about today primarily deal with the Iraqi government's policies, in many ways, to understand any of the four parts of Kurdistan, you need to recognize the ways that their issues intersect with all four states controlling wider Kurdistan, namely Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. Because Kurds as people lack a fully independent state of their own in North Iraq, northwestern Iran, southeast Turkey, and North Syria, this leaves them vulnerable and oftentimes at the mercy of the dictates of the surrounding states, who, despite their own rivalries, will usually come together and unite to keep the Kurds from gaining full independence or autonomy in any one of the regions. As for the KRI in Iraqi Kurdistan, this is no different. Historically, the region has suffered a range of tragedies and persecutions from the central government in Baghdad going back to the 1970s, but perhaps more famously remembered from the Saddam's chemical gassing of the Kurds in Halabja in 1988. This was part of the larger Al-Anfal genocide carried out against the Kurds in Iraq, which killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 3,000 villages. Following the first US war against Iraq in 1991, the Kurds in northern Iraq gained some autonomy because of the US no-fly zone, which for the first time allowed them the space to control some of their own affairs. This was increased following the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which solidified a de facto autonomy in the region. However, the emergence of ISIS in 2014 produced another challenge for the region as the Kurdish Peshmerga forces battled ISIS in Iraq, similar to how Kurdish forces did in the neighboring Rojava in Syria. As a result of these battles, the areas the KRI controlled was enlarged to include areas that Kurds traditionally lived in, but which were not included in the original KRG governed areas. These disputed territories, like Kirkuk, a historically important city to Kurds, sometimes called the Kurdish Jerusalem, where a good amount of the oil is also located, became disputed as both the KRI and Baghdad wanted to control them. Following the independence referendum that the KRI Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Following the independence referendum that the KRI held in 2017, which saw an overwhelming majority of Kurds vote for independence from Iraq, the central government in Baghdad invaded and seized many of these disputed areas, creating the current map we have today. And since the KRI is governed by the two main Kurdish parties, the KDP and the PUK, who each relatively control half of the region, Baghdad has also sought to utilize disagreements between them to increase the their own leverage. And the issue where this most plays itself out is with oil. Essentially, Baghdad argues that although the KRI has autonomy, the sale of oil from the region should be managed by them. And earlier this year, the International Court of Arbitration agreed and ruled in their favor. This creates a range of complications and implications for the KRI, as many argue that it removes their autonomy from Baghdad, since so much of the budget comes from oil sales. The argument is that it gives Baghdad control over the region, which is supposed to govern its own affairs. But all of these issues will be discussed in more details by our esteemed panelists who know far more about this issue than me. So I will now hand it off to them for their insights. Our first speaker is Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who is an author, commentator, policy advisor, and former diplomat. From 1993 to 1998, he served as the first US ambassador to Croatia, where he negotiated and signed the 1995 Urdut Agreement that ended the Croatian War of Independence. Other roles during his distinguished career include being a staff member of the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations from 1979 to 1993, directing the UN mission in the East Timor in 2001, and serving as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations in Afghanistan. His more than 3 decades of experience on the ground in Iraqi Kurdistan and Rojava give him unique insight into this issue, which he will share with us. He was also part of the documenting Saddam's use of chemical weapons in the 1980s and advised Iraqi Kurdish leaders during the negotiations for the new Iraqi constitution. He has authored 2 books, including a bestseller entitled The End of Iraq, for those who want to follow him more. So with all that said, Ambassador Galbraith, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Dr. Fuad, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And let me jump right into the topic. First, I don't believe that Baghdad wants to dismantle the Kurdistan region. I don't think that is the problem. The problem is that Iraq has been unwilling to implement the constitutional arrangements that Iraq itself made with regard to the Kurdistan region and for the establishment of Iraq as a federal state. And I will add here that there is shared responsibility on the part of the leaders of Kurdistan for failing to implement provisions of the Constitution. Let me say, what was the constitutional bargain? The Constitution, the core idea was that Kurdistan would be a self-governing entity, as it had been between 1991 and 2003, when at that time Iraq exercised zero authority in Kurdistan. But as a self-governing entity, it would delegate a few powers, a few very limited number of powers to the central government. So the Iraqi Constitution provides that the Kurdistan region, and indeed any other region, and the thought was that there would be other regions, would have its own parliament, its own president, its own judiciary, its own military, that is the Peshmerga, its own criminal and civil code, its own power to tax, its own power to spend, control over all natural resources. And that meant the way it worked was all the oil within the Kurdistan region and all the water except for the water that originated in Turkey or Iran, essentially the Zab and the 2 branches of the Zab, as well as the Tigris. And that was fairly extensive power, because after all, natural resources isn't just the water and oil, but it's land, public land, minerals, and a whole host of other things. That it would control its economy, education, its security, and its defense. And this is embodied in Articles 110, 115, and 121 of the Iraqi Constitution. 110 says that the federal government has it's a list of exclusive powers, and it's a very short list of exclusive powers. It includes foreign affairs, which would be normal for a state. It includes formulating national security policy and managing the armed forces of Iraq. But again, Kurdistan would have the right to its own military. Formulating fiscal and customs policy, currency, regulating international trade, national bank, standards and measures so that the standards, weights, and measures so that a kilo in Kurdistan is the same as a kilo in Baghdad, citizenship, broadcast media, which is very normal. You can't have, subnational entities competing for the same broadcast frequencies, population statistics, and regulating water that originates outside Iraq. Article 115 says very clearly that if it's not an exclusive power of the federal government, that is listed in Article 110, then it is in the event of a conflict of law, it is the regional law that prevails over the federal law. And Article 121 reinforces this by saying that the Kurdistan Parliament has the power to amend or cancel the application of any federal law within the Kurdistan region, except for those that relate to matters under the exclusive power of the federal government. Now, there's two provisions that relate to oil, and obviously oil is central because it has to do with the ability of the Kurdistan region to be financially self-sufficient. As one said, he who controls the revenues has the power, and Kurdistan was very keen to control the revenues, the oil within the Kurdistan region, of which there were no producing fields in the Kurdistan region in 2005. Kirkuk, the first major oil field in Iraq, was not within the Kurdistan region. Kurdistan wanted to develop its own oil because it understood that without having a source of revenue under its control, it could not be whatever the guarantees of independence in the Constitution, they wouldn't be translated into reality. So there were two provisions that were relevant. Article 111, which has been often cited by centralists, says that oil and gas are owned by all the people of Iraq in all the regions and governorates. Frankly, that was a highly ambiguous statement, but also an irrelevant one. It doesn't say the oil is owned by the federal government, but Article 1, or that it's managed by the federal government. Article 1, it's all the people, but not the government. Article 112 makes clear who manages it. In the case of an existing oil field, which was one which was in production in 2005, the primary responsibility goes to the federal government, but although the regional government is also involved, but on a condition. And here's the key to understanding the constitutional arrangements. That condition is that the revenues are distributed among the regions and governorates according to population, with something additional to those regions, i.e. the South and Kurdistan, that were destroyed by the Saddam Hussein regime. And the second part, and then it said, and that is fields that were in production at that time. It says nothing about fields that were not in production at that time. So if you want to understand where they are, you go to Article 115, because anything that isn't in Article 110, or you could say even Article 112, falls under 115, meaning the regions have priority. And this was by design. The design was that over time, as new oil fields came online, regions, and it was not imagined that Kurdistan would be the only region, that regions would control those resources and keep the revenues. And this would, over time, shift power from a centralized state of Iraq to a more decentralized one. So what happened? Well, all this was eroded from the start, notwithstanding the very clear bargain that President Massoud Barzani negotiated, particularly on oil and gas. The central government never accepted the words of the Constitution. So when Kurdistan proceeded, as it was entirely its right to develop its own oil industry, that was challenged. Kurdistan, from the start, never insisted that the oil revenues from new fields would come to Kurdistan. It was always willing to share them as part of a global budget. But probably the biggest thing that never happened is that there were no automatic distribution of revenues. Instead, the KRG share of the budget, share of Iraq's revenues, which was not a share of the budget. But the budget is expenditures. The revenues are what you're getting from the oil revenues. The KRG was meant to get an automatic amount equal to its percentage of the population, whether it's 12 or 17% or someplace in between. That never happened. And instead, it went through the budget, meaning that the government in Baghdad, that is the prime minister and his cabinet, made recommendations, and the Council of Representatives then had to vote their share. And that was never part of the constitutional arrangement. Since then, Kurdistan's authority has been further eroded, and again, in an unconstitutional manner. When the negotiation for the Constitution took place, there was the question of the Supreme Court. And Kurdistan, and perhaps also its American advisor, was deeply suspicious of the powers of a Supreme Court, having in mind exactly how the US Supreme Court had behaved a few years before in the Bush v. Gore decision, making a decision that the 5 Republican justices would not have made had Gore been ahead of Bush. So they were aware of the dangers of a partisan court. The partisan court idea was being pushed by Bremer, of course, the people who benefited from such an arrangement, and that was not a model that Kurdistan wanted. So Article 92 provided that the Supreme Court would be set up by a law passed by 2/3 of the Council of Representatives. Why 2/3? Because it was felt that that number would ensure that the jurisdiction of the court and the appointment of judges would protect the rights of Kurdistan. Such a court was never established. So there is no legitimate federal Supreme Court in Iraq. But the court that was appointed by Bremer, created by the Americans, continues to function. It asserts that it is a Supreme Court, and it has attempted to invalidate Kurdistan's control over its own oil revenues, specifically using Article 111 to say that the federal government owns the oil resources, which is not, of course, what Article 111 says, or that it gets to control them. It has gone on now to make further decisions, and again, not a legitimate court, ruling, for example, that the Kurdistan parliament has gone beyond its mandate, and that no decision of the Kurdistan parliament is valid. Well, I mean, that first, it had no authority to do that. And secondly, even if you look at the powers of the Federal Supreme Court in the Constitution, they do not have the power to settle disputes within the Kurdistan region. That's a power that belongs to the Kurdistan judiciary. Incidentally, more or less just the way it is in the American system. If there's a dispute in my state of Vermont over some issue relating to the operations of the Vermont legislature, that dispute would be settled by the Vermont courts and ultimately the Vermont Supreme Court. It wouldn't go to, there's no federal question. And again, the Constitution, if there was a federal Supreme Court, and again, there wasn't, it gets to settle disputes between regions and between regions and the federal government, but not disputes within a region. And yet it has asserted that power. Now, there are a couple of points I said where the Kurdistan has not really asserted its constitutional rights. And I'll cite three examples. First, it never really fought for the block grant. It accepted the idea early on that it would be getting a share of the federal budget. It has consistently accepted that Baghdad has some kinds of authority in areas where it doesn't constitutionally. Education, for example. Baghdad has no role on education in the Kurdistan region. Kurdistan can have a completely different educational system if they want. Baghdad doesn't regulate personal status in the Kurdistan region. That's something entirely up to Kurdistan, and yet Baghdad's authority has been accepted for some of those things. The second issue is that Kurdistan bears some responsibility for the failure to resolve the problem of the disputed territories. Article 140 of the Constitution required a referendum in Kirkuk and the other disputed territories, Kanakin, where you're from, by the end of 2007. That was never held, and yet at that time, Kurds held significant power in Baghdad. So, they bear some responsibility for that, the failure to implement that article. And then a third example, which I find really hard to understand, is that the Kurdistan parliament is now asking the Iraqi High Election Commission to supervise the upcoming Kurdistan parliamentary elections. In fact, the Iraqi High Election Commission has no authority to supervise elections in Kurdistan. That is the authority of the Kurdistan Election Commission. So if you want to be, if you're going to be fighting for your to preserve the Kurdistan region, to make it strong, yes, Baghdad has been consistently eroding those powers, but in other ways, there are certain issues where the Kurds and the Kurdish leadership could have done more to fight for them. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your insights, which I believe help explain all the complexities around this issue. I'm sure our viewers might have some questions for you, which I will hold off until both speakers have presented. Please write your questions in the Q&A. Our next speaker, who I will introduce, is Vincent Campos, a senior contributor at the Washington Kurdish Institute. Mr. Campos recently completed a long and distinguished career as a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. State Department and as an officer in the U.S. Coast Guard. His international assignments in these roles saw him working 4 times in Iraq, but also in Chile, Bulgaria, Bahrain, and Romania. As an Iraqi analyst, his portfolio saw him work at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, where he helped support the constitutional process and dealt with Kurdish affairs, including the disputed territories that I mentioned earlier in my remarks. He was in Iraq during the 2007 surge and again in 2013 to help counter ISIS operations and Iraqi civil society. So with that said, I will hand the floor over to Mr. Campos for his insights on our topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for the kind introduction. And just to let people know, if you haven't seen it, about every 2 or 3 minutes, the Zoom connection recycles. I don't know if it was just me or everybody else. But when it recycles, I'll stop talking unless you can somehow still hear me, and that's why. To the top, or to start my remarks, actually, I wanted to mention that in one regard, or a very important regard, I agree with Ambassador Galbraith quite strongly on the title of this event, and actually I had a similar reaction. And given the title, I would also suggest a subtext along the lines of the death of Iraqi federalism, and that, in addition to that, the dismantling of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. In that regard, I see on the larger picture, I've seen over the years where essentially federalism never really had much of a chance. It was clear that the Kurds wanted to benefit from federalism. At the same time, over the years, the central government and the majority members of the central government never really displayed any interest to pursue federalism to the greatest degree possible, and almost to the lowest degree possible. So that's why I offer that subtext. Now, ever since the 2005 Iraqi constitution came into force, from my perspective, it seems that there, with regard to certain leaders in Baghdad, there seemed to be a ambiguous and essentially at the same time, a deliberate strategy of animosity towards the people of the Kurdistan region, and in particular towards the leaders of the Kurdistan regional government. In that sense, it seemed like the rivalry between Erbil and Baghdad was exacerbated by a constitution that was actually designed to minimize rivalry, was designed to diminish the role of the central government, and also provide more powers, as Ambassador Galbraith described, to the regions, and then also to the provinces, which essentially was the foundation for the idea of federalism. Is the central government no longer attempting to seize control over all affairs in Iraq, but to distribute the powers so that the provinces and the regions, as they would ever form, of which it was already one region, they would have more autonomy in their work. So in this regard, there's 3 particular items that I'll mention. Some I'll just talk about briefly and leave room for Q&As if there's a particular area to follow up. But in light of the idea that the erosion of the autonomy of the Kurds has really been happening the entire time there's been a modern Iraqi government. And so most recently, I'm talking about both in the last 6 months and also the last few years, there's 3 items I want to touch on. One is the Iraqi budget. Another is the PMF system, needs attention, and then also the provincial powers law. Now, looking at the Iraqi budget for a moment, it's unfortunate that the new Iraqi budget really marks the return of a dominant central government, and Baghdad has set itself up that way, which, from my perspective, the new budget can probably be seen as one of the greatest accomplishments to date by the Iranian-influenced coordination framework. Essentially, all the work and efforts over the years has finally been encapsulated by the coordination framework and their ability to pass a budget which does not serve most of Iraq and absolutely does not serve the Kurdistan region favorably whatsoever. And there's numerous elements in the budget which set Iraq on a course to continue to minimize any gains in federalism, which were not many, but any of those gains that were made in accordance with the 2005 Constitution, or at least in parts of it. One particular area or aspect of the budget that directly impacts the Kurds is exactly the issue raised by Ambassador Galbraith with respect to the management of oil and gas. Now, Article 12 or 112 has traditionally been seen as an item that required or called for a strategic framework and a law to, and whether this was interpreted incorrectly or not, but was seen by most parties as a requirement to establish an overall oil and gas law so that the Kurds knew what their responsibilities and their authorities were. And at the same time, where Erbil, the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad could be, with regard to oil and gas management, could be delineated in that law. But as we've seen, the law has never materialized. And now that the main elements of the law are encapsulated in the new budget, which absolutely serves is a disservice to the Kurdistan region. Now, shifting over for a moment to the PMF. The PMF, as most everybody on this online fully understand, was that the PMF was originally intended as a temporary measure to battle against ISIS. I was there in Baghdad when ISIS came streaming across the border into Anbar province, and I was there when they took Mosul without much resistance, and I was also there when the Iraqi special forces entered Anbar and battled continuously to do the best they could to try to contain as much as possible the ISIS incursion and essentially ultimately to keep them out of Baghdad. But other than the special forces, there were very few other armed forces that had any impact against ISIS, and consequently, the PMF, as initiated by Ayatollah Sistani, came into being. But again, that was only supposed to be a temporary measure. But now, as we've seen in the new budget, not only have they become essentially an institution of Iraq, but they've actually grown in size. They've increased in size. They're essentially an autonomous body, and this autonomous body, besides having a significant amount, or gaining a significant amount of resources through government coffers, they also have their own engineering firm, the Muhandis Construction Company. And the Muhandis Construction Company is ideally situated to gain access to the largest of the government contracts available, which would only increase the size of the PMF and increase their power. But unfortunately, as we've seen with the PMF, they've had a debilitating influence on the Kurds, especially with the PMF, both in Kirkuk and also in the disputed zones. And with the closer relationship with Iran, that has also created a continuous source of conflict, in particular, as we've seen over the last couple of years, where Iran has fired rockets into the Iraqi Kurdistan region with very little response from Baghdad. And finally, I'll just mention briefly the Provincial Powers Law. As we know, about 5 years ago, the central government disbanded the provincial councils. And at the same along the same lines, the Provincial Powers Law, which was born out of many years of negotiations and work to finally work its way through the parliament, was suspended. So going back to talking about federalism and the impact on the Kurdistan region, the provincial powers or provincial council authorities, those are removed by dissolution of the provincial councils. The Provincial Powers Law, which was intended to decentralize authorities in Iraq and allow the regions and provinces to become more autonomous, that was suspended. And in view of the impact on the Iraqi Kurdistan region, again, over the years, there's been a cumulative effect, which has continually eroded the authorities and ability of the Kurdistan region to act at the level of autonomy that they originally intended to act. So in summary, the central government has rarely, if ever, demonstrated commitment towards federalism in accordance with the 2005 Iraqi Constitution. Rather, they've actually done just the opposite. And secondly, the Iranian-influenced Shia political party leaders have also shown very little interest in the affairs or in enhancing the affairs of the Kurdistan region. Again, they've shown just the opposite. And not only have they acted in opposition to the detriment of the Kurds, but also to Sunni-dominated provinces and even to Basra, which actually should be, if the budget system was implemented in accordance with the Constitution, should be flush with money based on the local production of oil. And then finally, getting back to the Iraqi budget, I see that as a culmination of efforts over the years by influential Shia leaders to finally reduce the influence and authority of the Kurds in every way possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campos, for those valuable insights to the situation on the ground in Iraq. They help explain why this issue is so important for policymakers to understand and how they affect the entire Middle East region. So I would like now to open the floor to any questions from our viewers. To do so, please raise your hand on the Zoom and I will call on you. When I do, please give your name and affiliation if you would like, and then ask your brief question while clarifying which one of the panelists you are asking. But I would like to ask the first question to both of our speakers. Going forward, what role do you think the US government can play in ensuring that Baghdad does not end KRG autonomy or even perhaps militarily invade the region? And if Baghdad were to invade, do you think that the US would support KRG? Thank you.
I defer
Vince, you
to
want
my
to go ahead?
ambassador.
Most recently in the US government.
I'm sorry?
You were most recently in the US government.
Okay, I am certainly more than happy to kick off a response. Essentially, what's interesting is this question actually is actually one of my very first additional note if the discussion went into this direction, but not only for the U.S. but I think what I viewed as for the international community. And in essence, what I've seen is, and what I'm concerned about, is the minimal reaction of the international community with several affairs that have been going on, several activities going on recently, and in particular, what I view as a horribly disastrous Iraqi budget. The U.S. and the international community, from my perspective, has demonstrated a muted response when actually I would had hoped that the State Department, at a minimum, would have spoken very strongly about the Iraqi budget and the need to essentially make some fixes in the diplomatic speak that they could use without sounding too disruptive. But with regard to, for example, the idea of a Baghdad-led invasion of Kurdistan, unfortunately, there's already a history of something similar to that. And as we all saw with the following the referendum of 2017, when Baghdad, led by the president at the time, who was also a Kurd, essentially invaded Kirkuk and did their part with U.S. weapons and equipment to expel, to the greatest degree possible, Kurdish authority within Kirkuk. And so I would fully expect that if there was an incursion or a buildup towards moving on Kurdistan, I would absolutely expect that at that time the U.S. government would have to speak up. I can't say what they would do, but my hope is that would demonstrate a red line that they could not sit there and watch from the sidelines.
So I agree with Vince, at least as far as the current U.S. administration is concerned. I will say that the U.S. has never had a president who knows the Kurds as well as Joe Biden. And I will say I was the one who introduced him to the Kurds when I worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And when days after Saddam invaded Kuwait, Jalal Talabani called me up and said, "Do you think it'd be useful to come to Washington?" I said, "Well, if there was ever a time when people are interested, you better come now." And so I took him to the committee along with Sami Abdul Rahman and Hoshyar Zabari, Mahmoud Osman, and met with the senators, including Senator Joe Biden, who has been a great friend and who went to Iraqi Kurdistan in 2002, that is before the U.S. invasion, spoke to the Kurdistan parliament. And in the various interactions when he was vice president under President Obama, he was absolutely a sympathetic ear. So I feel quite confident that were there to be a military action against the Kurdistan region, that is the one that within the borders that it now has, that the United States would side with the Kurdistan region. Incidentally, the use of the Iraqi army internally is prohibited by the Iraqi constitution. So what happened in 2017 was unconstitutional. But what was unconscionable in 2017 is that the then president of the United States permitted Abu Mahdi Muhandis, a man who was convicted of blowing up the American embassy in Kuwait in 2004, so an anti-American terrorist. Donald Trump permitted that man to use American Abrams tanks in an attack coordinated by Qasem Soleimani to attack Kirkuk. It doesn't get more bizarre than that. And of course, should that individual ever return to the White House, I think there'd be even more things. Now, as to the question of what the U.S. is doing diplomatically in Iraq, well, having served in the U.S. as an ambassador in the crisis of the day, in my time, it was the Bosnia War and the Croatia War. Today, it's the Ukraine war. The United States does have a problem, at least in my observation, that it's tough to walk and chew gum at the same time. So with all the focus on Ukraine, a lot of other problems are not getting the attention they deserve. The situation in Iraq is one, as Vince has rightly said, and even the situation in northeast Syria, which also is very urgent, is not getting, in my view, the attention it deserves.
Thank you very much to both of you for your insightful answers. I would like to ask a second question before opening the floor. Do you feel there is a risk that Turkey and Iran come together and basically try to divide the KRI between themselves and replace the yellow and green zones with the Ankara and Tehran zone? How can the US government help prevent this? Thank you.
Well, I'll take that first, and I think the answer is there's no danger of that. First, it's worth remembering that the KRG and Turkey, and particularly the Turkey of President Erdogan, have had very good relations. The largest investor in Turkey, in KRG, is Turkey. It was, you go to the hotels in Erbil, they're Turkish. The airport, a lot of the construction was by Turkish companies. It was Turkey that built the pipeline to enable the KRG to export its oil without the approval of Baghdad. So it's Turkey that has facilitated the de facto independence of Iraqi Kurdistan. And with regard to Iran, it doesn't have, in my view, the capability of having a significant invasion of Iraqi Kurdistan. I don't think it has the will to do that, and it knows that such a thing would be face fierce opposition. Also, it's not necessary because, as Vince has pointed out, it has huge influence on Baghdad. So why would it bother to come across the Zagros Mountains when in fact its allies are the people who are running Iraq?
Yeah, I can briefly add to that, because I also agree that I don't think the issue is Turkey or Iran invading the Kurdistan region. Essentially, if they did, the negative ramifications would greatly outweigh an invasion. But in light of that, then the question becomes, what would be their interests? And Turkey has already shown that they could attack the PKK targets on Kurdistan territory without any blowback from Baghdad. There's the occasional diplomatic protest, but that's been one of my questions over the years has been, where's Baghdad? Is targets are being hit on Iraqi territory. I mean, either Kurdistan is part of Iraq or it's not. And if Baghdad says it's part of Iraq, then why aren't you reacting to Turkey taking military action and having military forces in Iraq? And I think we know the answer to that. So Turkey would rather enjoy the situation that has developed over the years and then just continue to grow it. With respect to Iran, actually their advantage would be to cultivate stronger contacts with the PUK, to take a less confrontational approach, but actually take advantage of the division between the KDP and the PUK. They do have friends in the PUK that, or they do have those liaisons already established. So it actually would work much better for Iran to wrest away PUK influences to be Iranian friendly. At the same time, Baghdad wouldn't complain about that, and they would probably encourage it. And then ultimately you have the I was going to say Iranian PMF, but the Iraqi Iranian PMFs that would provide security for related situations. So I think that's probably how they would approach it.
Can I add something? I think the reason that Iraq doesn't protest these attacks on the Kurdistan region is, in fact, that Iraq or Baghdad does not actually see or think of the Kurdistan region as being part of Iraq. And this is why, over the long term, I'm very optimistic about the prospect for an independent Kurdistan, at least within the current borders on the territory of the former state of Iraq, because the population has, in a free and fair referendum, which was actually a binding referendum, it wasn't self-executing, but binding, voted for independence overwhelmingly. And many Iraqis are of the view that this is a problem that we would just be as well done with at some point in time. It's not a dissimilar phenomena to what took place with Czechia and Slovakia, even in former Yugoslavia with regard to Slovenia, which everybody was prepared to let go, and with the Balts in the Soviet Union.
Thank you to both of you for your invaluable insights. So we have the first question from the panelists, how the Kurdish division is playing a role in weakening the region. I think that in part you have answered to this question.
Let me say, everybody knows the statement that the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. But I have an addition to it. The Kurds have no friends but the mountains, and they have many enemies, and the worst are the Kurds. I mean, Kurdish divisions, if it wasn't for the Kurdish divisions, there would be an independent Kurdistan on the territory of Iraq, what is now the territory of Iraq. And it's ridiculous.
The second question, Iraq lacked implementation of Article 140 as the area remains under the de facto control of militias backed by Iran. How can Kurds leverage Baghdad over the disputed territories?
I can go ahead and start that off. As we know, Article 140 is a carryover from, I believe, Article 58 the TAL, but essentially it was a unresolved issue in Paul Bremer's days, and consequently it became Article 140, which had a 2007 due date. But it became very clear quite early that resolution of the disputed territories was much more complicated than many people imagined. And here we are in 2023, and there's never been any progress in the disputed regions. And in fact, even when I've looked at UN material and they've looked heavily at this problem, there are a wide variety of maps that describe the disputed areas, which differ greatly. So the disputed addressing Article 140 would take a monumental effort and a monumental dedicated effort, and it deserves one, as that entire area, which stretches into Connaughton and also into to Connaughton and then south, is not, the situation not getting any better, and it won't get any better. It'll continually erode the possibility of bringing some kind of stability to that area, and it requires a massive amount of attention that actually nobody in Baghdad is willing to give.
I would add, actually come back to the U.S. role. First, in 2005, the U.S. under the Bush administration actually did everything it could to try to thwart the degree of autonomy that the Kurds were seeking. And they were unsuccessful, but they absolutely wanted a much more centralized government. They wanted a more powerful Supreme Court. They wanted the central government to control all natural resources, and they were not happy, either Jerry Bremer or the Bush administration, about the procedures of Article 140. They simply wanted it put off, and then when the time came, both they and the UN said, well, the time's not right, so that the deadline wasn't met. Again, I'm sorry to say, but I think the Kurds also could have done more to insist on the implementation of Article 140 at the time it came up. But my view, and my Kurdish friends won't all like this, but my view, if you look at modern states, having large territories is not connected to success. In fact, the most successful state of the post-World War II period is Singapore, which has no natural resources and no territory. And so a relatively homogeneous Kurdistan, without inheriting all the problems of the disputed territories, it would be a stronger, more viable state than an expansive Kurdistan that includes a lot of people who don't want to be part of Kurdistan. Obviously, it would be good to resolve the issue, figure out a formula. There are places like Connaughton, which clearly should be part of Kurdistan, parts of the Kirkuk area and so on. But in the end, there's a viable state of Kurdistan within the current borders that's been incredibly successful. If you want to know the difference, just make a trip between Kurdistan and other parts of Iraq, or a trip between Kurdistan and northeast Syria. Northeast Syria looks very much the way Kurdistan looked when I first went there, which was 1984. And whereas Kurdistan today, again, talking about the region within the administered by the KRG, looks a lot more like Dubai. Not my favorite architecture, but still a place of great prosperity.
Yes, please, Vladimir, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, my name is Lami Vilgeberg. A quick question, Mr. Galbraith. So what does he think How do you think the Kurds can respond to Baghdad's pressure on the Kurdistan region through the federal court? How they can respond to that? And another question, how do you think the PUK and KDP can resolve their differences? I mean, you have been involved in this in the past. I mean, inter-Kurdish tensions in Syria, but now there are also inter-Kurdish tensions in Iraq. So what do you think about that? Is it just as insolvable, or what do you think about them? Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
In terms of the intra-Kurdish tensions between the PUK and the KDP, they're the worst they've been in my view in many years. Obviously, it hasn't descended to the level that it was when the Civil War was fought in the 1990s. And I think there are reasons for it. One is, with Jalal Talabani's death, there've been, leadership issues within the PUK, and including, the most recent struggle between the cousins. So it's the party has not been able to engage as the way it should. But I hope that the Kurds, that the two sides can work together, and I think there are various outside parties that are trying to mediate, and I think that mediation would be helpful. Sorry, the first question was? But what was the
first question was, how do you think the Kurds should deal with the pressure from Baghdad, from the Supreme Court or the federal court?
The Supreme Court. Look, I think they need to make clear that the Supreme Court is not a legitimate body, and its decisions have no standing whatsoever. The Constitution says very clearly what is the Supreme Court. So it's declared that the Parliament is dissolved. Well, no, the Parliament's not dissolved, because the court is not a legitimate court, and it has no authority to dissolve the Parliament. The court has no authority to make a decision about who controls the oil and gas of the Kurdistan region, and in fact, the KRG has correctly rejected that. And if I can make a small correction, what the International Court of Arbitration decided was not that Baghdad controlled the oil of the Kurdistan region. That was not an issue. And in fact, in a previous case, a British court did determine that the KRG controlled the oil and gas of the region. What the court found was that by exporting Iraqi oil through the pipeline, or oil from Iraq through the pipeline, that Turkey was violating. Turkey was violating the treaty agreement for the pipeline. So it had nothing to do with the internal politics, with who actually owned the oil or who was entitled to export it within Iraq. It had to do with the interpretation of the Iraq-Turkey treaty. And I would like to just add one other thing. There's just been a huge amount of misinformation about this, and I have to say, frankly, sloppy work. Today, there's a piece by Marina Ottaway from the Wilson Center. She says that the decision was by the International Criminal Court. Really? No, it was the Court of International Arbitration. She claims that Iraq seized the airports in Kurdistan. No, they didn't. They shut down the airspace. She says that, it used to be you could come into Kurdistan without a visa, but now you can't. No, it's the same system as it's always been. She says that President Barzani had said the referendum was consultative. No, he wrote both in the Washington Post and to President Obama and to the Prime Minister of Britain that it was a binding referendum, but not self-executing. So she says, and this is an important point, that that there had to be a hydrocarbon law. No, Article 110.2 does not say there has to be a hydrocarbon law. It says that the federal government and the regional governments need to agree together on necessary strategic policies, nothing about a law. And what are strategic policies? Well, strategic policies principally had to do with how you allocate production and yet stay within your OPEC quota.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Professor Ofrabenjo. What did the US do to stop Baghdad's erosion of the constitution and its effects on the Kurds?
But I can go ahead and start with this one, because also it reflects a little bit of the conversation we just heard with regard to Baghdad's respect for essentially the rule of law, whether we're talking about proper use of the court systems or adherence to the Constitution. There's been countless examples since 2005 where the Constitution has been subject to a tremendous variety and a wide variety of interpretation, of which a lot of interpretation was simply erroneous. And at the same time, Baghdad has employed or relied on various court decisions, again, erroneously, but they have relied on court decisions, and essentially they've gotten away with their follow-on actions based on court decisions, mainly because Erbil isn't in a position to declare Baghdad's actions as illegal. They can protest, but we've seen that whether it's legal or not, Baghdad will move forward. So the sad reality is strict adherence to the Constitution and strict adherence to the legal process will not stop Baghdad from their own interpretation of how matters should be carried out in the country, and consequently, they will determine the way forward. And again, I think the best current example is with the latest budget, where essentially they've run over what should be unmistakable rights, regional rights, and in this case would be rights and authorities of Kurdistan, and those rights and authorities have been completely disregarded in the budget. Unfortunately, there's very little that the Kurds can do, mainly because Baghdad isn't interested in listening. So we're in a very, very difficult situation in Iraq right now. And again, eventually, the international community will need to speak up. And as much as there's attention on Ukraine and other areas, I'm also focused on Ukraine, and I speak on the Black Sea security and Ukraine reconstruction. But that doesn't mean that a lot of us are also, that's not an excuse for ignoring Iraq. There's some very specific issues in Iraq. The US has an embassy in Iraq. They have a consulate in Erbil, and their focus should be on Iraq, and it's clearly on Iraq. The NSC continues to look at Iraq, and the head of the Middle East policy from the NSC is one and the same Brett McGurk, who has a very long history in Iraq. So there's no shortage of people with Iraqi experience at state in the NSC, and there's no shortage of U.S. government representatives in Iraq. And as a result, they need to be bringing issues to the attention of Washington, and they need to speak up when it's time to intervene at the right level, to speak diplomatically at the right level. But they can't really allow Baghdad to modify the rules of the game to fit their needs to the detriment of Erbil and Kurdistan.
Look, if I can add, the first point is, that this is something where the Kurds also have to resolve this with Baghdad. I mean, the U.S. can't fix every problem, but I would also say one of the problems for the Kurds is that they've listened to the U.S. too often when it's not been in their interest. In 2014, Kurdistan was on the verge of declaring independence. As President Masoud Barzani said at the time, I have a 1,030-kilometer border with the Islamic State and a 30-kilometer border with Iraq. Isn't this the time for independence? Just at that moment, John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, showed up and said, don't do it. But if he'd done it then, I think there wouldn't have been much of an argument. To always look to the U.S. to provide guidance. Well, not all of it's great. The same thing on the referendum. The U.S. kept saying, don't do the referendum, but it offered nothing. President Masoud Barzani told the New York Times, what was his greatest success in his career? It was the referendum. Now, everybody else thinks it's a mistake, but I'm with President Barzani that it was a great success, because once you've held the referendum, you've established the legal basis for independence. And there's no taking it back. I mean, nobody can say that, as Condoleezza Rice and George Bush Jr. said, the Kurds want to be part of Iraq. No, that isn't. Everybody knows that isn't true. Now, in terms of dealing with the decisions of the Federal Supreme Court and other actions of Baghdad, the KRG has declared them to be illegal. It has said the court has no authority, and it has refused to implement the decision that the court made, which isn't a court, to require that that Baghdad manage the oil and gas. The only thing that the Kurds have had to do, Kurdistan government, which in some sense was always a sensible thing, which is to let SOMO market its oil. Why was it sensible? Because SOMO was going to get a better price than independent exports. And while the Constitution is completely clear that Kurdistan controls its own hydrocarbons, because they're all new fields, the Constitution also says that the federal government controls international trade. And, it's not a hard argument to make that exporting oil is international trade. And the thing that was really important for Kurdistan, again, was to have its own resources, because that developing resources, because that is power. That's the basis for either your autonomy or eventual independence.
Thank you very much. I will now ask our speakers to make briefly their closing remarks. Thank you.
Vince, why don't you go first, and since you went second last at the beginning.
Okay, and I'll be brief. First of all, I definitely appreciate the questions that were asked and the wide variety of issues. I strongly believe that it clearly demonstrates that Erbil-Baghdad relations and conflicts within Kurdistan itself are not simple problems to resolve. In fact, the way I see it, it's only becoming more and more complex and complicated. And as I indicated in the very beginning, and with my comments, is that Baghdad has for years worked diligently to erode whatever authorities they felt that they could remove from the Kurds. And despite any legal arguments that the Kurds have a strong legal basis and have complete authority to make a wide variety of decisions the fact remains, if the Kurds are not exercising their authority, and if Baghdad is taking away those authorities without impunity, then ultimately it doesn't matter what the Constitution says. It doesn't matter how legitimate the court decisions are, and it doesn't matter what the Kurds are dreaming of. The situation for the Kurds will not and cannot get any better just because they feel they're in the right. The Kurds have to take a hard stance with Baghdad and start fixing these issues. If they don't, Baghdad is going to continue to run over the Kurds, and as we've seen in the budget, essentially all rights regarding oil and gas are now in the hands of the budget process, which has no validity whatsoever. However, that's the direction they're heading. So that's my main message, is that the Kurds really need to look out for themselves and get their house in order and not let Baghdad continue to weaken the Kurds at every opportunity.
Well, I strongly agree with what Vince has just said, and I won't. There's no need for me to repeat it because he's said it very strongly. And above all, of course, the Kurds who have a lot of influence in Baghdad should be, working together, and there's certainly more that they can accomplish. I don't feel the situation is completely dire. If you go to Kurdistan, you realize there's no visible Iraqi authority there at all. And Kurdistan continues to control, manage, license its own oil resources. Iraq hasn't taken that over, and Kurdistan has not agreed that it can take it over. So, things have not they've not gone south in such an extreme way. South being Baghdad. I wanted to address one very good question that an anonymous listener posted in the Q&A. And that person said, hey, when the Constitution was being drafted, weren't these problems foreseeable, and why weren't proper legal mechanisms put into place? And it's a great question. And yes, the problems were foreseeable. But what you have to understand about the drafting of the Iraqi Constitution, and this is true of other constitutions as well, but particularly the Iraqi Constitution, it wasn't a group of people, of legal scholars sitting down to say, what would be the great constitution for a country? No, it was a process of bargaining among different communities, including the Kurds, who really didn't want to be Iraq at all. So it was really much more akin to the negotiation of a peace treaty than it was of somebody trying to design a great system of government for a country. It was a peace treaty, and the federalism provisions were essentially a peace treaty between the Kurds, who wanted to maintain as much independence as possible, and on the one side, and the U.S., and who wanted a more centralized state. And frankly, the dominant people on the Iraqi side, the Arab side, were the Shia, who were not all that committed to a strong unitary state at that time, because the dominant force was scary, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was for its own form of federalism at the time. So, and why was there ambiguity there in places? Because that was the only formula of words that could be agreed. And so, yes, I wish it had said the oil of Kurdistan will be controlled by the people of Kurdistan or the government of Kurdistan. But instead it says the federal government with the regions manage existing oil fields. And then it says if it's not listed earlier, it's a power of the region. So you get to the same result. But there's no ambiguity about what was intended, what was agreed. But the problem remains that Baghdad has been unwilling to honor the bargain it made. And that is and many other parts of the Constitution as well. I mean, I pointed out they haven't set up the Supreme Court. They haven't set up the Council of Regents. There's supposed to be a second chamber in the legislature, which would be an essential protection for Kurdistan and governorates and other regions. They've made it impossible to create other regions. So there are a whole series of things that have not been done to implement the Constitution, because basically the dominant forces in Iraq and also I certainly would say Iran are against the basic constitutional bargain. And that's why Kurdistan's continued presence in Iraq is not viable. That's why in 2017 there was a referendum on independence, and why I'm convinced sooner or later Iraqi Kurdistan will achieve independence, as it should.
Yeah, if I may, I'll do 60 seconds on the Constitution, since that was my portfolio at the embassy, and I was quite close to the entire process. The process was challenging. The UN played a tremendous role in bringing experts over. For the first few months, the Constitution drafting process was in the hands of the father of the Constitution, Sheikh Humam Hamoudi, and the Constitution drafting committee. They did their part to cobble together the Constitution, and actually did a lot of outreach to make sure they had as many pieces of the Constitution as possible. That all worked up until the first deadline, and the first deadline was August 15th. That was the deadline for the draft Constitution to be approved by the Parliament ahead of the October 15th referendum on the Constitution. So in the weeks before August 15th, that's when the political parties then took over. That's when they fully engaged. And that's when as they call it, the sausage making process really took effect, where each major group, Kurds, Shia, Sunni, everybody, grabbed their copy of the Constitution, did their late night changes, and every day there were edits and compromises. And that could have gone on probably for a couple of years, and there never would have been a Constitution completed. Even the October 15th deadline was extended by 10 days, for which a lot of American NGOs complained that it violated the TAL, because now you're into 10 days, and our response was, and the UN's response was, we're not going to worry about any such violation. They're getting it done. So they finally got it done 10 days later. It went out for a referendum October 15th. It was passed, barely. But everyone recognized that there was still work that needed to be done, but the Constitution never would have been finished. So they had to give it the best start possible, and there were enough components in there, if it was implemented, for a large portion of the Constitution to work. But as Ambassador Galbraith indicated, a lot of the Constitution was never exercised and never implemented, and to the detriment of the entire country. Thank you.
Since we have used our full hour of time, and 1 hour and a half actually, unfortunately we will have to stop the panel there, but I want to thank you, both of our speakers, for taking part in this discussion today, as well as all of you for watching and participating. I also want to thank the Washington Kurdish Institute for organizing this panel and encouraging all of you to follow their efforts on their website and social media pages. Hopefully, this is not the final word on this topic, but the beginning of a much larger conversation on Kurdistan and the Kurds, a right to control their own destiny. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.